Hi everyone, my name is Dr. David Patton and I'm an Associate Professor in Criminology, and so I'm really here today just to talk about some of the insights and kind of share some of the knowledge that I've gained from working in the addiction recovery field. I'm going to be sharing their wisdom and their insights throughout this presentation. And what I so often see in the addiction recovery world is that you go to a conference or an event, and then partway through that event, you'll see kind of Tom or kind of Rita, Tracy or Billy kind of share their kind of story of, how they kind of got into addiction, their story during addiction. And we'll hear about the dire life circumstances and all the trials and tribulations that they faced. And over time, we'll begin to see that kind of change occur and that turning point. And then we'll begin to see how they turn their life around and that kind of rise of kind of the triumphs and the overcoming. And it's a real powerful story. But what I want to suggest here today is that maybe their stories are not just their own stories. And actually maybe their stories are telling and are contributing to a bigger story. Because I think what so often occurs as researchers and when you go to these events and you listen to kind of those stories is that actually you hear certain factors being mentioned, such as child abuse, childhood trauma, living in certain kind of negative environments, for example, a lack of kind of social connection and support in their kind of upbringing and kind of formative years, and a whole host of other kind of negative factors, shall we say. And what happens is those ingredients, those variables, if you like, are then somehow, if not explicitly, certainly kind of it's assumed that those are the causes of addiction. And what happens is that then gets twisted into that those people are responsible, people like that are responsible for getting into addiction. And so it becomes kind of, in effect, a sort of kind of blame culture that people with those characteristics, and let's talk about race here, let's talk about social class, so on and so forth, people from certain postcodes or geographic locations, those people over there. And really that's not the truth. So what we come to understand, and what I'd like to suggest, is that maybe we've been lied to, that actually some of the meta stories that we've been given, some of the roadmaps that we've been given for life, kind of the roadmap to success, the roadmap to happiness, the way in which we kind of organize our lives, the things that we seek, the things that we value, the things that we pursue, maybe don't lead to the promise that we've been told that they do. And maybe these macro factors, which I believe are linked to coloniality and capitalism, because I think that those kind of lead to paradigms, perceptions, beliefs, relate the ways in which we relate to each other, forms of living that actually aren't helpful at all. So what I began to do in my research is I began to look at kind of contemporary culture through that lens of how is coloniality and how has capitalism begun to shape the way in which we live. So if we think about the average individual, key emphasis on the word individual, it's broken us down into individual units. And so it's individualized as it's separated us from a sense of community, of moving as a pack, moving as a tribe, or coming as a community. So it's now all about me and what are my dreams, what are my aspirations. And actually, when you look at the majority of people's aspirations, it's all about the pursuit of the material. It's all about that career progression. How many zeros have I got in my bank account? And what square footage is my kind of accommodation? And what postcode do I live in, darling? So what we see is that pursuit of the material has led us to kind of move away from family because we're looking for the next job, the next promotion, and we'll move wherever the money leads. And so we separate ourselves from family relationships, from kind of community and friendships, but also the busyness of life. And we understand that if we're earning that money, that we need to perform, that we need to be productive. And in the workplace, it's not a healthy workplace because it's all about that performance culture. So I feel that pressure to perform. And if you're on my team and you don't perform, well, then that notions of blame and labeling, you will be kicked out and excluded from my team if you're not performing. And I'm aware that if I'm not performing, that I'm going to be kind of removed from this organization. So the nature of relationships are transactional. We're not here to support one another. It's not genuine relationship. It's actually transactional. And it's about what value do you bring to me, to my team, and my organization. And the same in my life. So my friendships are made up of people who are interesting, people who can help me in terms of whatever my particular goal may be. And what that leads to over time is increased loneliness, because I could become much more kind of disconnected, first of all from myself, because actually we are whole people. And so pursuing just one facet, the material, is one really important ingredient to life, but it's not the whole kind of perspective. So I become disconnected from myself, but I'm also now disconnected from kind of genuine friendships, family members, and even the relationships in my kind of workplace where I spend the majority of my kind of time. Again, that notion of kind of living this competitive life, trying to outdo peers, trying to outdo my colleagues. Competition is at the heart of what I'm doing. And really, it's all about creating this comfortable life and consumption that I can buy whatever I need. And therefore, because I'm self-sufficient, I don't need anybody for anything. I always find it funny, kind of, especially in summertime on the street that I live in, that we're all there individually mowing our lawns with our own individual lawnmowers. And we've all got our own kind of hedge trimmers. So there's no sense of kind of collective kind of ownership and sharing of our material resources. It's like we've all got our own kind of sheds with the exact same tools and ingredients. We've become so kind of boxed in to being self-sufficient and not being able to kind of share or even ask for help and be vulnerable with each other. So I don't think that contemporary culture is producing, when you look at the levels of kind of mental health, of the quality of life, levels of happiness, we know that those are all kind of in the negative. But the good news is, as the quote from kind of Graham kind of says, that societies eventually develop antibodies to addictive new things. And so, yes, maybe some of the roadmaps that we've been given right now at this historical time point, and let's remember, it may feel like that's the way things have always been, but when we look back throughout history, capitalism has not been around forever. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, and there are alternatives to it. So we can develop these alternatives, these antibodies. And what was fascinating to me when I was working on a National Institute of Health research project, I was speaking with people with lived experience of addiction recovery, and we were talking about what works in addiction recovery. And they were sharing kind of the tools and the practices, the kind of habits and rituals that they would have as part of their recovery practice. And they felt that they had different roadmaps to the average person. They felt they had different beliefs, different values, that the way in which they conducted their relationships were different. And actually a number of people in that project began to articulate how that for them, the reason why they'd been able to make this transition from addiction to recovery, from kind of pain to healing, and so on and so forth, was actually because their practice of recovery was a form of this antibody to the reasons for their addiction. And so I began in my research to think about what would a culture of recovery look like. So I began to interview people in addiction recovery. I kind of spoke with people who had worked in addiction recovery. And I also analyzed a whole range of artifacts that people use in addiction recovery. So we know, for example, I analyzed songs that people had written in recovery. I looked at the artwork that people had produced. I read the poems. I listened to the spoken word recordings, so on and so forth, of people in recovery. And I thematically analyzed what they were speaking about, singing about, drawing. And I began to kind of code the culture of recovery. And I recently had it published in a journal article, and what I found was that you have this strengths-based recovery that's founded on a culture of authenticity, of strength, of social solidarity, and also generativity. And when you look at some of the key ingredients of that culture, it's all about connection, it's all about community, it's all about collaboration and contributing not only to each other, but also giving back to society. And it seems that their lives are infused with kind of meaning and purpose. They use creativity on a daily basis. That's part and part of what they do. And authenticity is at the heart of how they conduct their lives. So I'm just going to give you kind of two examples from the culture of recovery, just to go into a little bit more detail. So I think kind of the first example I will give is around social connection. And as Maya Angelou says, I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. And so for every person who's gone through addiction, you may feel like you've gone through it alone, or when you tell your story that it's just your story. But actually, everybody else in recovery is there standing by your side, shouting and cheering you on. And as you look at the type of relationships that people have in recovery, they've got each other's back. There's a ferocity of support. And yes, they ask for help. Yes, they share when they're feeling vulnerable, when they've had a bad day. They're not scared to say that stuff. But what's also interesting is that they can sense and they can tell when their friends are feeling low or vulnerable or a bit sensitive. So oftentimes the help isn't even asked for, it's provided before they ask for it, because there's that sense of attunement to each other. And what we see though in society, in contrast to that, is that recently the UK has appointed a Minister of Loneliness. 9 million people report that they often feel lonely. And research shows that the impact of that social isolation is akin to smoking 15 cigarettes a day and is greater to the reduced morbidity for obesity. So this stuff is real. The impact of kind of capitalism and the way in which we're organizing our lives is reducing lifespan, is reducing the quality of life and the well-being of the population. So the second example that I will give is around meaning and purpose. And what you see is for people in recovery, that at some point during their journey, and when that comes is different for everybody, but actually they discover a sense of purpose to their life. And I'll tell the example through one person's story. And this young gentleman kind of was in addiction recovery, and he shared how for him, education was not a positive experience. So he left school with no qualifications. You know, he'd had lots of negative labels applied to him during that educational experience, which kind of impacted on how he perceived himself and also the goals and aspirations that he then went on to have or did not have more precisely. During one of his addiction recovery support groups, he was kind of often the guy who was there encouraging others during those sessions, asking those challenging questions, kind of showing empathy, creating rapport with others in the group, and really kind of being someone who was a real kind of mentor and support to others. And after a few months of this kind of occurring, the leader of that kind of particular group kind of just took him to one side and said, you know what, you're really great, and kind of shared with him his observations and reflections of the skills and capacities that he'd observed in him. And this guy was blown away because nobody had ever affirmed him. And so to be kind of recognized in that way meant a lot for him. And so the leader of that group kind of then said to him, you know, I want you to think about in time when you feel ready, I'd like you to kind of take over leading this group if that's something that you would like to do. And that was the first time anybody had ever offered him a leadership role. And it blew him away. And it held up a mirror to him to see that actually he had some skills and strengths and capacities that he'd never seen in himself before. And that validation he was good at something just meant the world to him. So he said yes to that opportunity. And after a short period of leading that group, he then kind of built up that confidence to go, do you know what? I can see that I'm good at this. Why don't I return to education? And so he kind of pursued a coaching qualification. And before he knew it, he kind of was offered a part-time role in that organization. And on the story went. He then got a full-time job. He then got a promotion, so on and so forth. But I don't want the emphasis here to be on the external, because actually what meant more than anything to this person was him living a life of meaning and purpose, and that's what he'd got from that experience. And that's what I think is so key. There's often this kind of narrative that occurs in addiction recovery that you have to wait for this kind of rock bottom moment or this series of negative life events to occur that will then stimulate this kind of change. That'll be that wake-up moment when you kind of decide, I'm going to turn my back on drugs or alcohol or whatever the addictions are for you and make this positive change. And sure, for a minority of people, that happens to be their story, that's their truth. But from my own research and looking at the literature and doing interviews with people with lived experience of recovery, actually, that doesn't bear out in the data. Instead, what comes out is a whole range of pull factors, things that propels a person forward, that envisionment propels them forwards, gives them a new sense of meaning and purpose, and fuels and sustains their recovery and their journey. Now, when you kind of look at different phases of addiction recovery, research has shown that there are 3 distinct phases. There's the early kind of phase, which is the first year of addiction recovery. There's the sustained period, which is years 1 to 4, and then the stable recovery, which is kind of 5 years plus. Now, these are not arbitrary categorizations, because when we look at the relapse rates of people in recovery during those distinct phases, we see that the chances of relapse in that first year is up to 75%. It's a very chaotic phase. However, when you get to the 5th year of stable recovery, 5 years plus, your chances of relapse reduce to 15%, 15%, which is the same chance of myself, who's never used any drugs or had any issues with addiction with substances. I've got the same chance of developing an addiction kind of career as they have. So they kind of return to that same level of risk as the general population, which is just fantastic. When you map out what is occurring in that first year of addiction recovery, what I found is there's a whole long list of kind of pains of recovery or addiction. It's things like childhood trauma, it's things like violent relationships, domestic abuse, unemployment, menial jobs, poverty, or people involved in criminogenic activities, so on and so forth. Low self-esteem, a sense of hopelessness and purposelessness, and other factors. The list is exhaustive. But when you move to kind of the stable phase of recovery, the relationship reverses. The number of pains of addiction or recovery reduces. Now look, there's no magic wand. Nobody's life is perfect. Mine isn't, and I'm sure yours isn't. So there are still some ongoing pains. Why? Because we're human, and that's just life. But actually the number of strengths and capitals, capacities, and pull factors, as I call them, the majority, and they dominate that person's life. And in fact, what they say is that now their life is better than their life, not just in addiction, but actually pre-addiction, that they now live a life that is beyond a life that they could ever have imagined. What we see here is a range of pull factors, and those pull factors, again, are many. Some quick examples are healing. Actually dealing with that childhood trauma, it's the healing that comes in that pulls that person forward in their journey. Why? Because it's that unearthing of identities. It's discovering that place within them that was inviolate, or understanding that those old identities can be erased or seen from a different lens or different perspective. It's things such as the meaning and purpose that I spoke about. It's things of creating new social networks, positive social networks, that opens up new paradigms and opportunities to life and living, new ways of seeing the world and seeing themselves. But what can be really frustrating for those people who work in the field, and I started my PhD back in the late 90s. And when you look at the kind of drug policies that were kind of being produced by the government then and the drug policies that we've got today, or we look at the approaches to addiction and treatment and recovery, we can see that the practices haven't really changed much. Some of the labeling has changed and the staff titles, the job roles have kind of got slightly different emphasis. But in essence, the approaches are the same. And so the pace of change can be really frustrating. But I really believe in the quote kind of from Bruce Alexander that says that society will change at a gallop when its worldview changes. But its worldview will not change until an alternative philosophy appears, together with images, with ceremonies, music, and metaphysics that can give it in human hearts and minds kind of that kind of tangibility. And that the talented people who can produce this new alternative approach will intuitively materialize, as others have in previous eras of despair and confusion. And he goes on to say that we can only hope that they will appear sooner rather than later, and that we are able to recognize them when they do. Well, I'm here to say that to all those people in addiction recovery, that I see you and I hear you, and I understand that what you're offering is exactly what the world needs at this time, at this moment in history, where we are in our cultural understanding and the way in which we live our lives. We need you, and we need to learn from you. And that's why I really believe that the greatest task before us, as Paulo Freire says, the greatest historical task of the oppressed is not just to liberate themselves, but also to liberate the oppressors. Because what research is showing is that people in addiction recovery now have higher levels of quality of life and well-being as compared to the general population. But what you so often see, because of that kind of hegemonic story that's been told that says that the people in addiction and offenders are bad people, that they are less than the good people over here, the respectable people, the people who don't have issues, the people who are succeeding, the people who've got money and lives in certain postcodes. What's happened is that it's created this approach, I think, amongst people in recovery to almost kind of go around with a kind of metaphysical begging bowl, going, will you accept me? Will you give me a seat at your table? Will you embrace me? But actually the people that you're going to have got lower levels of quality of life, lower levels of well-being, and their social ties and quality of relationships are less than yours. So it makes no sense to me. And that's why my encouragement to you is don't believe who they say that you are. And there's a fantastic quote by Salman Rushdie that really encourages people to kind of tell your story and to retell it, to look at it from different vantage points, to be able to joke about it. Because until you get to that place where you're able to retell your story and own your own story and take power over it, and what I would say is for you to kind of go back through that story that you tell yourself about who you are and what's happened to you and where you are now, that story that you share with kind of close ones in conversation, or maybe even the story that you share with people on stage when you're invited to speak at events or organizations, to mine that fertile soil of your story and to look at it for any pollutants of the oppressor's language. So for example, something that I often hear, and this is your story, so it's entirely over to you, but I'll often hear phrases such as, "Hi, I'm David and I'm 10 years clean." But where's this notion of clean come from? Because as I see you and as I listen to your story, I don't see you as unclean before you entered recovery. I don't see you as dirty whilst you're in addiction or in your offending behaviors or negative relationships or whatever other factors were going on in your life at that time. So where have these labels come from? And so my encouragement to you is to kind of look at your story again and tell it from that kind of pure and authentic place and from that empowered place. So I believe the mandate before us is, as Toni Morrison says, and she so powerfully kind of, at a time, she was a black female in America, and she was an author and editor of books. But of course, writing books in the 1960s in America, in the height of kind of civil unrest of segregation. She faced much discrimination. But she told her story. She wrote books about the Black experience, and she didn't allow the white voice to come into her work. And so the quote that I want to share here, she said that, "I stood at the border, I stood at the edge, and I claimed it as central. I claimed it as central and allowed the rest of the world to move over to where I was." And so that's my encouragement to all of us in the addiction recovery field, that actually maybe some of what I've shared today may have been challenging, may even sound a bit crazy. But actually, we've got to stand on the power of this knowledge base. We've got to stand on the power of your transformative ability to move from addiction to recovery, that you're living now at a high level of quality of life and well-being than general society, that your relationships are deep and rich, and the levels of authenticity are cultivating such an amazing life. And others need to hear that. So my encouragement is that you would receive this message, that you would consider it, that you would take hold of it, and that you would run with it, and that together we would march on. Thank you.